Бизнес – это риски. Выявлять риски и эффективно управлять ими помогают решения интерфакса. Создавая эти сервисы, мы опираемся на наш опыт работы с информацией, знание потребностей клиентов и качественный контент. IT-решения интерфакса преобразуют информацию в знания. Они помогают нашим клиентам вовремя принимать решения, снижать риски и расширять деловые связи. Интерфакс – IT-системы для бизнеса.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Johann Pretorius. I'm Head of Mining Research at Renaissance Capital. My colleague Stephen Friedman is our precious metals analyst, and we will moderate today's panel on the impact of COVID-19 on commodity markets. We have a panel of esteemed speakers with us today, and it is my privilege to introduce Lord Barker, Executive Chairman of EN+, Mark Gyetvay, CFO and Deputy Chairman of NOVATEK, Anton, Marketing Director at Nornickel, and Dr. Alya Samokhvalova, Deputy CEO of Petropavlovsk. Alya, congratulations with your secondary listing on the Moscow Exchange today. It's a privilege to have you here with us. Let me give you a bit of an introduction to what we would like to discuss. COVID-19 is having a major impact on the global economy and on the operations of companies worldwide. The IMF forecasts a 4.9% contraction in the global economy in 2020 due to the pandemic. This is much worse than during the 2008 financial crisis. This will reduce commodity demand, but could be somewhat offset by investment-driven stimulus. While supply disruptions could negatively impact the operations of some companies, they are likely to support commodity prices to some extent. We believe the virus may permanently change some of our habits and could lead to structural changes for many businesses. We also believe it could strengthen the focus on ESG. There will, of course, be winners and losers due to COVID-19. The virus presents a threat to those that are slow to adapt, but may offer opportunities for companies with strong balance sheets, low-cost operations, and visionary management teams. If you would like to ask a question to the panel, please send them to us in the comment box next to the video player on your streaming webpage. We will have a short Q&A session at the end, and the most interesting questions will be asked to the panelists. To start our discussion, I would like to explore the impact of COVID-19 on the businesses of our panelists. What measures did you implement to mitigate the impact of the virus? And are you able to run your operations close to capacity despite measures to contain the virus? Lord Barker, may we start with you? How's the virus impacting EN+'s operations? And Lord Barker, you're just on mute.
Good morning, everyone. We're very fortunate at the N+ Group that despite this terrible pandemic, our business has proved remarkably resilient in large part thanks to our extraordinary employees and the quality of our assets. But of course, like everyone, we have been hit by the crisis, but operationally, the business has continued both in the metals division and the power segment. Obviously, aluminium prices suffered a fall pretty early on, although there has been some recovery. And in terms of demand, we are certainly seeing a contraction in global demand. We think probably about 2.5 million tons for the year as a whole. But our core business is stable. Our power business is very stable, drawing on our hydroplants on Lake Baikal, and the supply chain right the way through our aluminium business remains operational. So we hunkered down early. We took a number of steps very early on, and I think we're managing our way through this crisis.
Thank you very much, Lord Barker. Alya, our perception is that Petropavlovsk response to COVID-19 was also quite successful. What was different to your approach?
Well, I think we were in the position that we were sort of supposed to be hit quite early because our operations are right on the border with China. So luckily the Chinese borders were closed very early, and so our response was very early and very prompt and comprehensive. Straight away at our company, we created a steering committee which on a daily basis, well, first of all, developed a set of measures and secondly, implemented. And when we were developing this set of measures, we had one overall big objective, which was health and safety of our employees and support to all our stakeholders. And within this one overall objective, we identified several important stages or areas of the activity of our company on which we focused. First of all, we tried to keep our operations intact, which was done, and with the great actually support of the Russian government and local government. Our enterprise was on the list of continuous enterprises as an enterprise which supports the economy of the region and provides a lot of employment. So we didn't stop our operations even for one day, but in order to do this, we implemented a number of unprecedented measures to keep, as I say, our employees safe. That was sort of one very important area of our focus. Second area was supply chain, because obviously a lot of businesses around us were affected severely. But us being in actually quite remote location and with a very low density of population, it helped. But the biggest help was our strategy, long-term strategy of trying to rely more on the local suppliers, and support businesses around us. In this situation, it helped us because it has facilitated logistics. So our supply chain was virtually unaffected. We had only some small delays for equipment which we were bringing from Finland for our new projects, but they were very, very minor. And the third area was obviously sale of our product, which also initially was representing some difficulties because of majority of transportation of the product is by airplanes, but again, with some facilitation of license regime to send our product abroad, we managed to cope with it. So yeah, it was not easy. It is still very difficult to be on top of all the measures which we implemented. But I can now say that it looks like we coped, at least with the first wave of the COVID, very well.
Thank you, Alya. Well done. Certainly an impressive achievement in this very challenging environment. Mark, may we turn to you? What are the key priorities for NOVATEK in these uncertain times?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. Being the only oil and gas representative on this panel of mining companies, I think we had a different perspective on COVID-19. We were really, I would say, impacted more directly by seasonal weather than we were with, say, the economic lockdowns that happened across the board. I mean, if we look at the global lockdowns, many of these occurred sort of mid-March. So, the first quarter was largely impacted by, a unseasonably warmer winter weather. And we're dealing with that. I think we've had 2 seasons in a row now where winter weather was actually warmer. And then we actually, in the second quarter, we had colder spring temperatures. But the company took measures quite early in February. We looked at the value chain. We wanted to ensure, since we successfully launched our big flagship Yamal LNG project, we had to make sure that we had the appropriate steps in place so that when ships and tanks were coming in and people were exchanging cargoes, we took appropriate measures to ensure that contact between crews and our workers on shore were very minimum. So we've actually taken steps to ensure that crews were isolated and we didn't have the intermix of people. Just like anywhere else, we were obviously affected. We have a large construction project going on in Murmansk, where we're building an LNG construction center, and one of our Russian contractors, Belostroy, had a large outbreak of positive tests, and so we had to deal with that question with the Murmansk government. Luckily for the project itself, is that each of the work camps were separated, so we didn't have the interchange of employees working together in that particular vicinity. So they were at a separate camp, and so the interaction between their employees and some of the other contractors were very minimal. So we were able to isolate sort of the positive test case in that one direction, and we took steps to make sure that we had enough testing equipment. We actually brought in, cruise ships that were actually not being used at this particular point in time, to use that as a place for people to stay in the bay up in Murmansk. We also had, obviously, since we're doing a big construction project with our next LNG facility called Arctic LNG 2, we have contractors around the world working, and one of the contractors that were building modules for us were actually in Wuhan, China. And so they had a slight slowdown of activity, but as we just announced just recently, they're actually now 2 weeks ahead of schedule. So we start seeing the opening up of economic activity and in the Chinese market. And we also had, Italy was impacted pretty dramatically in the European market. We have a lot of facilities and work being done in Italy. So I think given the unprecedented nature of a global lockdown, I think the gas industry, since we don't have much interaction on delivering of natural gas with contact to people, we actually handled quite well, and we were more impacted by the seasonality effect than COVID-19.
Thank you, Mark. Good to hear that at least you were somewhat less impacted than some of these mining operations, but impressive performance by your management team nonetheless to keep the show on the road. For the next topic, I would now like to hand over to my colleague Stephen, who will touch a little bit on the demand side and the demand impact.
Thanks, Johann. Looking at the demand for commodities during and post the COVID-19 pandemic, I'd like to get the views from our panelists about the severity of the demand contraction experienced during this economic slowdown and expectations for the shape of the economic recovery. I suppose that is the million-dollar question. Anton, as a leading supplier of nickel and palladium, could we please start by getting your views around demand for Nornickel's key commodities?
Well, Stephen, certainly the pandemic has a very sizable and negative impact on metal demand. I think we're not at the bottom yet, as we're very much upstream, and this negative impact is sort of climbing from downstream, from end users all the way up the value chain. So we've seen pretty good spot demand for palladium and nickel in April and May, despite what was happening to the global economy, and it's starting to slow down as we speak. We don't have high hopes for this year. I think we're looking at the double-digit numbers, percentage-wise, in a contraction of demand. And there will be a bit less supply, but definitely not enough. So the commodity markets are shifting towards the surpluses. And I think one of the important consequences is lack of consumer confidence. Even with the economic stimulus, things will be better definitely than without the stimulus. But consumer products are very important in the end for commodities, and it will take a bit of time before consumer confidence is restored, to say nothing of the actual buying power of the population. But I think we're still en route, and we're yet to discover how things will develop, but we do believe improvement is coming later this year.
Thank you, Anton. Alya, maybe if you could elaborate on the current safe haven appeal for gold as one of the commodities out there that really has so far benefited significantly from the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, if you could just maybe discuss, the recent discontinuation of gold buying by the Russian central bank and whether that's had any impact at all on your business.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I always joke with investors that we're probably the only industry sector which rejoice when everybody else is not in that good shape. And obviously, with gold being seen as a safe haven, this recent months and beginning of the year, from gold price point of view and from demand point of view, was fantastic for us, because gold price is really not driven by supply and demand, but driven by fear and panic. And like in any slowdown, gold was performing well, and the uncertainty which doesn't go away is actually brings the hope in us as gold producers that that's where we will keep seeing gold prices. But you're absolutely right that Russian central bank, which was buying consistently virtually all Russian gold output for last several years, when the pandemic has started, announced that Russian central bank will stop buying gold. I don't think it was connected with the COVID.
I think we may have lost Alya there for a second. Maybe until she comes back, just to finish up, maybe Lord Barker, you mentioned that aluminium prices have been hit rather hard. What are your customers, what has been the impact on demand for aluminium, and which of your customers have been hardest hit by the pandemic?
Sure. Well, we're starting to see a recovery in the price from the low levels that it hit. But in terms of actual demand, it was the automotive manufacturing sector that was really the hardest hit, both in Europe and North America, with many of the largest players closing down for 6 weeks or more. We are seeing that open up again now, and demand is moving, but clearly this is going to create a significant logjam. However, on the plus side, I think a lot of people were surprised at how quickly China came back, whether or not it's to the status quo ante remains to be seen, but certainly China is moving again. And contrary to what a lot of people in the industry expected, there's rather than exporting aluminium because of a stalling Chinese economy, that we've actually seen a fairly unique phenomena where there's been a price arbitrage on Chinese aluminium in the last couple of months. And while we don't expect this to necessarily be sustainable, it has meant that even though in Western markets we've actually seen some closing of for good of certain uneconomic production facilities, and it has given the Western producers some breathing space. So I don't think we're certainly back to equilibrium in the aluminium markets, but it's could have been a lot worse. And the long-term outlook for our industry is very encouraging, and we'll probably go on to talk about this. But I think the whole approach, economy-wide, worldwide, to risk and existential risk factors means that people are looking much more carefully at their strategic plans and fast forwarding to a more resilient, low carbon, sustainable world. And that's good news for low carbon producers. So I think we're going to see a divergence sooner than many expected between the market for high carbon intensive aluminium, which primarily comes from China, and low carbon aluminium, such as that produced by our metals business, Rusal, the largest producer of low carbon aluminium in the world.
Thanks very much, Lord Barker. Yes, now we definitely will touch on the structural changes that are happening a lot quicker, it seems, as a result of the pandemic. Maybe I'll hand back now to Johann to touch on commodity supply.
Thank you very much, Steve. I would like to explore what your expectations are of supply disruptions or even curtailments within your industry because of measures to contain the virus, or actually just lower commodity prices due to the state of the economy. Anton, could we maybe start with you this time around? How material have the supply disruptions been for nickel, copper, and palladium? We here in South Africa, we're very aware of the impact that lockdowns have had on our metal supply, but it would be very good to hear your views.
I think that in the PGM space, most of the supply side challenges were in South Africa. It started before the pandemic with the absence of Anglo and energy supply issues, and this was further facilitated by the pandemic, but the lockdown wasn't total. Most of the mines continue to operate at least at part of their capacity, say 50%. So all in all, we can't blame the full contraction on the pandemic, but we're looking towards probably 7-9% this year. This is similar to what has been happening in the nickel space, except that in nickel we do have a rival, which is Indonesia, producing NPI, low-grade ferronickel product, and they have been ramping up despite the pandemic. So even with the contraction in China and elsewhere, Indonesia has increased their production and it covered the gap. So nickel has been pushed into surplus.
Thank you, Anton. So you still maintain the view that even for palladium, we could see a softer second half potentially price-wise?
Well, we think that palladium will be a balanced market after years of deficit. So that's the good news, that even the pandemic wasn't enough to push it into surplus. And we assume that we'll move in deficit as early as 2021. But of course, it depends very much on how the automotive sector will do. Because obviously the latest numbers on car sales are disappointing. Hopefully this market should recover, but none of us has a crystal ball. So we're just hoping for this.
Thank you, Anton. That's very clear. Mark, you already mentioned that the gas industry was perhaps less affected by lockdown measures, but how did lower gas prices influence supply? And then if you wish, and if you're in a position to perhaps comment on whether you believe OPEC Plus's measures to stabilize prices have been enough.
Yeah, I'll start with the OPEC Plus question first, and then I'll go back into the gas industry. We had, obviously an oversupply of crude oil, and OPEC Plus started a sort of a price war, probably at the most inopportune time when we started seeing the effects of an economic lockdowns, and we had a precipitous drop in obviously commodity prices. They gathered relatively quickly in May and decided to come up with a plan to cut production of about 9.7 million barrels of production per day, and we've had somewhat of a recovery in commodity prices from low 20s, which were clearly not sustainable on a long-term basis, to just about $40 a barrel right now. The oil industry was obviously impacted early on because it impacted the transport sector. So when we had cross-border lockdowns, et cetera, we had obviously an oversupply building up of jet fuel, and that created a problem. So we have still a ways to go, because there's still some uncertainty as whether or not the demand will continue picking up, and whether or not we have had a deep enough cut in the OPEC Plus of 9.7 to sort of balance out the market. On the gas side, what we see is that, as I mentioned earlier, we had probably more the impact of the seasonality, and we've already had a significant drop in commodity prices year on year in 2019, and actually carry forward to the first quarter. This impact obviously has a dramatic effect on people's investment decisions. And so when we look at a period of lower sustained prices, see, in our situation for NOVATEK as a low cost provider, we're okay for a period of lower prices. I think ourselves in Qatari are one of the lowest price markets in terms of cost, so we're able to survive in these sort of stress periods. But what we've seen on the supply side, the almost immediate impact was that there was a series of investment decisions that need to be made in 2020 that have actually been canceled right now. So we're starting to see the impact of lower commodity prices by cancellations of cargoes of liquefied natural gas leaving the United States to, say, the European market. And that impact started actually early on in February, where we saw a few cargo cancels leaving from Spain. And then more dramatically, beginning in April, we started seeing cargoes of about 25. May was probably 35 plus. And just recently in June, last week, we probably have 45 plus cancels of cargoes. And so the United States will actually serve as a balancing factor, probably on the supply side, throughout probably the summer months. If we look at the forward curve, we probably last through the summer months, maybe early September, hopefully a normalized winter, and then we can repeat itself again in 2021 for a period of time until we start balancing out the supplies. But yeah, we have a situation where a cancellation of particular investment decisions actually is good for us, because it balances out the supply side and makes it more reasonable.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. Mark, just looking at the supply situation in the aluminium industry, I guess all of us are wondering when we could see more significant supply cuts, just from a shorter term perspective. But then from a longer term perspective, the metals and mining industry has underinvested in growth capex for several years already. And we're just wondering, whether this level of prices will not scare away investment for many, many years to come. This is not only true for aluminium, this is true for many commodities. What does this mean to supply growth, in your opinion?
Well, I think in the short term, we're certainly talking about contraction. Always loath to make forecasts, but certainly there are forecasts out there that look at anything up to 1 million tons being shuttered over the course of the next year. Certainly with Rio Tinto and Alcoa right up there with potentially significant closures. And we do know that there are a number of smelters worldwide that simply weren't economic before COVID-19, particularly those that were relying on older technology. And if you look at North America, there hasn't been a new smelter built there for a couple of generations. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is an industry which is due for a shakeout. But our group, being at the top decile of cost and efficiency and production, this is something that we can potentially benefit from. But also, we have to, as a sector, attract significantly more investment going forward as carbon becomes a significant factor in the pricing of our metal. So given how long the investment time horizons are for major capital projects in this industry, and indeed across the whole sector, I think you will have to see a bit of a shake-up. So that's going to be old capacity coming out, but there does need to be an investment in new production facilities. For our part, we have our state-of-the-art Taishet smelter, which will bring on over 400,000 tons of aluminium in the 2020s. And that is something that we're very proud of. And while we have obviously been taking measures to protect our workforce and to be a responsible stakeholder during the COVID crisis, the smelter is nevertheless on track. So we expect a change in the profile of supply as old capacity comes offline, and the industry wakes up to the new low carbon age. Certainly for us as well, investing in power efficiency, we've got a new energy program that is looking at these huge assets that we have on Lake Baikal, and is over systematically upgrading and improving the efficiency of our production plants there. And that's going to increase electricity generation by about 2 terawatts from the same volume of water. And then we've got to really think outside the box and start thinking and investing in new low carbon or even zero carbon or even carbon negative technologies that are going to take us into the 2030s. So yeah, there's a lot on our plate, but I think keep calm and carry on is the way that we're looking at this.
Thank you very much, Lord Barker, and Ian Plus certainly has an enviable position when it comes to the low carbon aluminium footprint, and we'll touch a little bit on this later. In fact, I would like to turn to our next topic, which is ESG, which has become very topical over the last few years. But do the panelists believe the focus may shift away from ESG while the world is dealing with the consequences of COVID-19? Or could the virus and the increased focus on all stakeholders create even greater ESG awareness? And perhaps to open, Alya, could you perhaps comment on how this pandemic has evolved your thinking in terms of ESG?
It's actually a very interesting question because we started kind of changed our mindset in relation to ESG aspects of our business several years ago. Last year, we started a comprehensive program trying to make sure that ESG thinking is the cornerstone at every decision or strategy developed by the company. So when the situation with COVID happened, it was for a second, the feeling was maybe nobody will have time or money or resources to spend on this because people are facing very big challenging problems financially and operationally. And I was really surprised to see that from every side, the thinking about ESG not sort of decreased, but the focus on it has increased significantly. And especially, I would say, on S part of ESG, if there were last several years, we spent a lot of time speaking about our environmental impact. The issue of our social impact on our employees and local communities, every stakeholders, became very, very important. And from what I see from investors, all market participants, governments, people on the ground, that focus on ESG will be only increasing, and we are very happy as a business to align with this new way of thinking and trying to run our business truly purpose over profit in truly purpose over profit way, which seems to be an answer which, well, in general, humankind business is developing in this situation when it feels like somebody brought a mirror to us and we looked at ourselves and the way we were developing our business practices in industries last 50 years, and realized that some important things has gone out of the window, and we have to come back to basics and focus on person, on people for whom we are doing all this. So I think the focus has increased significantly, and it will be the whole reshape of the industries and way we are thinking about it.
Thanks, Alya. That's fantastic. So there could indeed be something good that comes from this terrible pandemic. Lord Barker, I would like to turn back to you, and we've touched a little bit on this before. I would like to know exactly how you see EN Plus benefiting from the LME's plans to launch low carbon aluminium trading. We certainly quite excited about it from a sell side research perspective. And perhaps you could even try and give us an idea what premium you believe low carbon aluminium could achieve one day on the LME. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, since I became executive chairman at the beginning of last year, pressing the fast forward button on the transition to a low carbon economy has been, a real priority for me, not least because this has been my background for the last 20 years. And so working constructively with the LME and all the companies and stakeholders who either consume or produce aluminium has taken up a huge part of my time. Now, occasionally I've been frustrated with the rate of progress. I would have liked to have gone faster, but in actual fact now, I think the LME have come up with a very sensible proposition, which is going to be market-based. And certainly the first step to creating a proper and orderly market is to have full transparency and full disclosure of carbon content. And by making this new passport available from next year, what it will do is begin to create effectively a new asset class of low carbon aluminium. Now, where exactly the threshold is set for what is deemed low carbon and what is deemed black aluminium, I'm relatively relaxed about at this stage, drawing on my experience as a minister with responsibility for the emergence of the European Union emissions and trading system, the ETS. I thought the most important thing of all these new market mechanisms is to build confidence at the outset rather than to be too ambitious and have a failure to launch. The most important thing is to get going, and then once you're going, to be prepared to iterate and improve as you go along. And I think the model of this new passport is that the LME have come up with will allow us to do exactly that. But I do think that a lot of people in the sector are going to be surprised at the rate at which this product is taken up and which it becomes the new normal. And I think the experience of COVID-19, as I said earlier, will only increase the market appetite to want to see all risks. And the risk, or if you're an investor, of putting your money into assets that could suddenly find themselves effectively stranded because of their exposure to carbon, or if you are a major manufacturer, you suddenly find that you are dependent on a supply chain with a very high carbon profile, which is going to be increasingly recognized in the cost of that supply. I think people aren't going to want to leave that for some time in the future. And certainly what we're seeing in the stock market is investors moving to price in developments in climate change policy and developments in technology and developments in carbon accounting that many people weren't expecting until the end of the decade, that they're pricing that in today. So they're effectively looking forward to what the world is going to be like in 2030, which I believe will be a very radically different world to the one we have now. And they're starting to price that in already. And our sector, the aluminium sector, has been very slow to move. But I think these latest announcements from the LME are going to make a real difference. Now, I don't believe that's going to mean an instant $400 a ton premium for low carbon aluminium. I'll be very happy to be proved wrong on that. But I think these are some of the numbers that analysts have been talking about as the eventual destination. I think it's more likely to be very modest to begin with. I just want to see a system up and running that will actually begin to show that differentiation and will give the market the information so responsible consumers of aluminium and ultimately the public out there who are the ultimate consumer can make a difference and can play their part in supporting and building a low carbon world.
Thank you, Lord Barker. Well done with your initiatives to get the ball on the roll. It's certainly perhaps just what the aluminium industry need to steepen that cost curve and to give an increasing benefit to low carbon, low cost aluminium producers such as yourselves. I would now like to hand back to my colleague Stephen to touch on the last two topics of today's discussion.
Thanks, Johann. We believe the virus may permanently change some of our habits and could lead to structural changes for many businesses. My question to the panel is, do you foresee significant structural changes in your respective industries? Firstly, in terms of the way you operate, and secondly, for the commodities you sell. Maybe, just to jump back in with Lord Barker, you touched on the structural changes earlier, but maybe could you elaborate on those views?
Yes, certainly. Whether or not green aluminium goes to a premium or whether or not high carbon aluminium trades at a discount, it's difficult to foresee. But what we do know is that we're not going to go to the status quo ante. We're also going to see, as a result of the economic damage that's been wrought by COVID-19, an unprecedented set of economic stimulus packages launched around the world. And certainly in Europe, which is our largest market, you can expect that huge economic stimulus to come with a very clear green tag attached to it. And so the types of projects which are being earmarked for fast tracking and for additional expenditure by governments are things like electric vehicle infrastructure, support for the next generation of electric cars, greater rollout of renewable energy, a focus on building sustainable buildings and energy efficient homes. These things which were already on the to-do list of governments around the world, I think they're going to rip that to-do list off the kitchen door and get on and start ordering these things. And the important thing is that as these stimulus packages are rolled out, and people are talking about building back better, so it's not just throwing money at the economy, that as they rolled out, that the materials that are used to build this new infrastructure that's going to be with us for decades to come, that the materials are themselves low carbon as well. So I think there's going to be this massive fast forward to a low carbon world once we've got past the immediate shocks of COVID. And this will, certainly in my industry, have a profound impact on bringing forward the shuttering of high carbon uneconomic smelters, where I think it will be, maybe there are a number of producers out there who have been holding on, hoping that the cycle will turn and that these facilities will have their day again. It's clear now that that's just not going to happen. So I think those big structural shakeouts will happen much quicker and much more dramatically than most people are expecting. And I think also there's going to be a change in people's appetite to risk. I said this at the very beginning. I think everyone from members of the public, civil society, investors, business, everyone's going to be much more cautious about making decisions without understanding the full risk factors that relate to those decisions. And that basically means we need a much more transparent world. And I think the partnerships between government and the private sector, between the private sector and civil society, mean that all of these programs are going to be launched.
Thanks, Lord Barker. Maybe I'd like to just ask Anton a similar question, especially just given how vehicle sales are incredibly important to demand for your key commodities. What are your views on the potential positive or negative impact on vehicle sales and also on battery electric vehicle penetration rates as a result of the pandemic, and potentially, the changes we're seeing in consumer behavior, less commuting, etc.?
To me, the pandemic is a temporary negative effect. The world will go back to its normal sort of path of development. So car sales would recover. It's just a question of time, as people still aspire to have cars. I'm very skeptical when people speak about, sharing cars and buying less vehicles, because this is not fully applicable to any place on this planet. It does make sense in some locations, but actually the pandemic gives a different push, that people would prefer something which is individual, not used by other persons, and thus more safe from the epidemic point of view. We are very bullish on the electric vehicles. The pandemic sets us back a bit, so probably the trajectory would not be as great as envisioned 6 months ago. But electric vehicles, both BEVs and hybrids, will be a bigger share of the car fleet. This is driven by regulation as well as consumer demand. People are becoming more conscious about the climate change and the environmental aspects. Maybe this is more focused for Europe, but I'm sure that the rest of the world would follow. So this means that our metals basket, which is essential to environmental protection, will have high demand in the future.
Thank you, Anton. Maybe Alya, just turning to you, Petropavlovsk is a company that really has embraced technology, specifically with your POX plant. On the mining side, do you believe we'll see increased mechanization in the gold industry as companies learn to operate under, increased social distancing measures?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because when we are thinking about the effect of pandemic and trying to assess what does it mean for us, whilst we were sort of in the forefront in Russian gold mining industry bringing new technologies, we realized that probably there are sort of two layers of these effects which we will be looking at hoping or maybe benefiting from. One is more wider industry wide focus, which means that interestingly that it might give some push to M&A activity, but as you say, M&A activity which is boosted not by super high gold prices like we see in the past when companies just for the sake of being bigger were getting in a very expensive acquisitions. I think that the cooperation industry might happen on the basis of new technologies, optimization, or maybe even streamlining businesses. This is especially applicable to Russian gold mining industry, which is facing the situation when the majority of our gold reserves and resources are increasingly represented by refractory material. And usually the industry used conventional methods which can't cope with that material to produce gold. So at the moment we have only two enterprises in Russia which can deal with this gold in one of the most environmentally friendly way, in high pressure autoclaves. Our plant, a hydrometallurgical plant, which is sort of part of a big hub in Far East, was intended long ago when we started even thinking about it to become a center for processing of refractory material in Russia. We have created a very significant research and development base, and we have very serious scientific engineering capabilities. So I think that it is more and more realization in the industry that future cooperations, and as I said, growth comes from the synergies and projects like this. If we're talking about sort of more narrow focus, internal company management and operations, the impact was very interesting experience for us because we had to deal with a very in a very difficult environment. We have offices in 3 locations in different governed by different authorities. We have operations far away in the far east of Russia. So the re-emphasized focus on smooth communications and new solutions were very important for us. This is something we are going to take in a new non-COVID, hopefully, world. We came up with a number of
Looks like we've lost Alya again. Maybe yeah.
I think from this point of yeah.
Go for it, Alya. Sorry, we lost you for a second.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Yeah, and I was just finishing saying that from this point of view, we think that this situation has really taught us a lot, and we will benefit a lot from the experience of working in a lockdown environment, in COVID environment.
Thanks, Alya. Definitely exciting times for the gold industry. For the final topic today, I'd like to discuss the potential long-term opportunities and threats emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic, which are likely to create winners and losers in the commodity space. Mark, maybe we can start with you. What are the key factors that differentiate the longer-term winners and losers in the oil and gas industry?
I believe the most important thing that we have to deal with today is obviously the cost and the change in commodity prices. I think there's an expectation around the world, as we just went through this panel discussion on ESG, carbon neutrality, et cetera, that industries are going to have a lot of pressure on them to meet sort of mandated government initiatives, and we have to determine how this is going to be paid for. I mean, I hear a lot of talk about green trade, et cetera, today, and carbon reduction, but we don't talk about who's going to pay for that. And so when we look at the industry, we also have to have a mission, where I talked about a lot of times previously on conferences, et cetera, that I speak at. We talk about, what is the responsibility of making these statements and really holding true to them? Because it's easy to sit there today and make these wild announcements that we're going to reduce X amount of carbon from the environment from 2050, but are we going to be there to answer when we do not meet those requirements? What is the responsibility for being apologetic? I mean, when we look at our industry going forward and making investments to see how we're going to power the world in 2050, I mean, let's not miss the point that the oil and gas industry has lifted billions of people out of poverty over the years, and will continue to do that. And we see already with the shift in the energy transition from coal to natural gas, we are making a dramatic impact on reduction of carbon. The other thing I think is also important that we kind of didn't talk about it, because we're looking at it from a commodity perspective. When we look at it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, people often fail to think that we are, as a collective group here on the panel, the polluters. In reality, the oil and gas industry contributes less than 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So 80% comes from the commercial side, consumers using products. And we have to find a way through this whole value chain to deal with this particular, question on how we're going to address, a carbon neutral world in the future to meet all these green movements. And when we look at COVID-19 and its impact on the lockdowns, many people are looking around the world and say, well, great, I can see everything's green, everything's clear, cars are being stopped, so no pollution. That's just not reality in the world. I mean, we're going to move out of this economic lockdown. We have to find solutions that are going to be driven sensibly from both the investors that are making these capital projects, like everybody here on the panel today, and the consumer side who wants to continue consuming. I agree with Anton. I mean, with the car situation, I mean, are we changing in a world where people are going to be reluctant to car sharing as maybe 6 months ago when people thought that this was a trend? I mean, I think we're going to have a significant rethink of how the world's going to look at least the next couple of years until we get a vaccine. And once we get a vaccine, I think we may go back to a normal market environment. But right now, I think we have still too many unanswered questions that need to be addressed that impact us as producers of certain commodities that actually drive many of the products that people are consuming or powering the world like we do in the gas industry. So I think we still have a long way to go, and I think there's a lot of uncertainties.
Thanks very much, Mark. Alya, with Petropavlovsk forming the secondary listing on the Moscow Stock Exchange, I'd be interested to get your views on the sort of longer term opportunities and threats. You mentioned earlier the potential for increased M&A in the sector. How do you see things playing out? Alya, you're still on mute.
I think it was a very important step for us today, the secondary listing on Moscow Stock Exchange, and thank you, Renaissance, being very helpful and operational on this. And I think it shows that we really within the company, we don't believe in deglobalization, and we still a very international company which brings best experiences from various jurisdictions. And as I said, from our point of view, the growth and opportunities comes from development of new technologies. This is our focus. We look at ourselves more like a technological company nowadays, because in a very short period of time, we managed to build up unprecedented facilities within Russia. And I'm not talking about only our coke logistics hub, but all supporting facilities. We started experimental test plant, which will allow us to develop new projects, very complex projects from metallurgical point of view, very, very quickly. So for us, the opportunities, the future, the growth is new technology and a reliance on a very experienced and qualified skilled workforce. So that's our way forward.
Thank you, Alya. Maybe finally, just to Lord Barker, what are the major threats and opportunities for your business in a post-COVID world? You've touched on obviously quite a few of them, but maybe if you could just sort of give us some key points.
Yeah, well, obviously the biggest threat to all of us, whichever sector we're in, remains a prolonged global recession, particularly if there's a second wave of the pandemic, and that would be a blow not just to the physical operations of many businesses, but also to consumer confidence around the world. So I think that's the sort of the number one, and obviously marching hand in hand with that is concerns, as we are, about the health and safety of our own workforce and communities. But in terms of the bigger changes, I think I sort of slightly disagree with Mark. I think COVID is going to leave a lasting impression and really drive forward some profound shifts that maybe wouldn't have taken place as quickly or possibly even as at all had it not been for this extraordinary lockdown period. And it's been a shared lockdown. That's been, I think, the most interesting feature of this. Every single country, bar a handful, but every single major economy has gone through this experience of locking down their populations. And I think the way that we work is never going to be quite the same again. I think the shift to remote working, the shift to the way that we work and interact, the fast forward in technology, such as the technology platform that we're using now, this will have an immediate impact. I don't pretend to know all of the answers. As I think, for many people, particularly those who are working remotely outside of city centres, but actually even those in city centres, I think people reconnected with nature in many ways and reconnected with the quality of their lives, and were able to reevaluate what's really important to them in the way that they work, in what they want to do with their lives. And I think one of the most negative things is it's going to be really difficult for young people. And I think companies, particularly big companies such as ours, all have a really important social responsibility to work with governments, regional, national, federal, to try and help young people whose careers have been, jolted, whose aspirations and working lives have been given a huge shock by this. So I think the thing that's going to come out of this and needs to come out is a lot more partnership working. We signed a letter last month. I signed a letter with 144 other companies under the aegis of the United Nations. I think we had a combined market cap of $2.4 trillion, calling for exactly that, calling for greater partnership working. And, even out of bad, some good things come. So on balance, I'm a real optimist. I'm excited about the long-term opportunities for our business, but there are some real challenges for us all to navigate that weren't there pre-COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Lord Barker. I think in the interest of time, as we are on the hour now, and most of the questions that have been asked have been answered, I think, during the panel discussion, maybe I'll just hand back to Johann for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Steve. It is clear to us that the virus is a major disruptor, but it does seem to us that many companies will remain stronger after the pandemic, and certainly the companies represented by our panelists today, to us, seem to fall into that category. We also believe that in order to rebuild the economy in a post-COVID world, we'll probably need all these commodities, all the building blocks in order to get us back on track. So we certainly see scope for NOVATEK's energy products in order to fuel an economic recovery. And longer term, it's quite encouraging that perhaps COVID had put the spotlight on how fragile humans are and our planet are, and it could speed up ESG, and that's probably the most positive thing that we see in this unfortunate tragedy. So with that, I would just like to thank everybody for participating in today's discussion, and thank you to all the panelists that participated in our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Бизнес – это риски. Выявлять риски и эффективно управлять ими помогают решения Интерфакса. Создавая эти сервисы, мы опираемся на наш опыт работы с информацией, знание потребностей клиентов и качественный контент. IT-решения Интерфакса преобразуют информацию в знания. Они помогают нашим клиентам вовремя принимать решения, снижать риски и расширять деловые связи. Интерфакс – IT-системы для бизнеса.